Okay, so if you're here, you're interested in learning about image manipulation techniques for creative control. One of the things you're going to get out of this is a very specific way to implement what's called aspect switcher, which is an image effect. To get there, we're going to go through a little bit of history. So bear with me as we do that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Mitchell. I do what I call a full stack consultancy. I tend to work with internal teams at organizations to level them up on things like Git and CI/CD and how to Drupal, how not to write a custom module, but instead use something like ECA or a contributed module, how to contribute back to Drupal. All that's kind of like baked into what I typically do. And then I backfill as a developer and sometimes as a presenter of things and all that kind of fun stuff. So that's why I call it full stack. I do the entire stack. I'm a musician and outdoor enthusiast. I probably run about 20-25 miles a week and bike usually about 30 on the weekends, so just love being outside. And you're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn or Drupal Slack. So let's talk about image manipulation and why it actually matters. Drupal's image manipulation, I didn't realize that was going to be hard to say, are kind of hard to beat. I mean, we can do all these amazing things with image styles and responsive image styles. We have image toolkits. We have multiple that we can interact with, so I'm going to talk about those a little bit. All of this allows us to create things that are really consistent for the editor to create something where they don't make decisions that are going to break their page. And it also allows us to really improve performance. I always say that image styles, particularly what I'm talking about today, is a way to empower editors who have like zero design skills. They're not going to go crop their own image. They're going to upload something. Basically, they've exported from their phone as a JPEG probably, and then they're uploading it straight to the site, and we want to do the best thing with it, right? So let's talk about performant image types. If you go back to the early days, 1993 is basically when images started existing on the World Wide Web. Before that, it was all message boards, everything was text-based, and it's around this time that two of the major formats come out, GIF and JPEG. And just a slight etymological detour here, we live in a world where GIF and GIT are acceptable, and GIF is okay. I personally think it's GIF, but if you say JIT, it sounds a little weird, So all that to say, we had GIF and JPEG as those two main formats, and GIF is for flat images, a few colors, logos, transparency, maybe if you want to do animation, Giphy.com back in the day. JPEG is when you have complex rasterized images, so lots and lots of colors being spread over things, gradients, shadows, all that kind of fun stuff. Shortly after these two image formats became like the de facto, PNG came into play, and it took a while for PNG to fully be supported by browsers. I don't think we had alpha transparency support for PNG until like IE7, something like that. It was kind of a weird time. Early days of the internet. So we don't really need to use any of those three image formats anymore. We now have two modern, widely adopted image formats in WebP and AVIF. Now, WebP has kind of full browser support at this point. It has really good support by various image toolkits. It is so much better file size than JPEG. I usually see anywhere from like a 70 to 80% reduction in file size using WebP over JPEG. So you really can save a lot of bandwidth by using WebP as a format, and you really don't have to worry about browser support anymore because it's been widely supported for well over 5 years by any of the modern browsers. AVIF is a little bit newer to the game. There's some trade-off with it. It does definitely create a smaller image. The trade-off is on the decoding time. So the browser actually, it takes it a little bit longer to decode. So even though it's 30 to 50% smaller than WebP typically, what you may find in practice is that it only performs slightly better than WebP because of that decoding time on the browser end. So the client-side decoding, if you will. But the browser support has increased for it. There is an open issue in Drupal core to support AVIF as a fallback in all the default responsive image styles and use WebP as kind of the default, which actually WebP is now the default for all the image styles in Drupal core if you're using Drupal 11 plus at this point. Best practice today, use WebP and AVIF. If you're not using those two image formats, you are wasting a ton of bandwidth, which is a sustainability issue. It's a equity issue in terms of delivering it to people with slower browsers on, like, say, mobile devices. Go ahead.
I have a question about that. Don't you mean an AVIF with a WebP fallback?
Yeah, I guess technically it would be that. So you use AVIF as the one that you want, but if the browser doesn't support it, it falls back to WebP.
Because WebP has better browser support, so you want to fall back to that.
I'll correct that in my slides. By the way, if anyone wants to follow along, joshawami.com/presentation/image-manipulation. I've got the full slide deck up there, and you're welcome to use it when talking to folks if you want to. We've got another one recently did, it's /unpack in that same directory. That's all about using recipes unpack if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Okay, so to actually transform images, Drupal interacts with what's called an image toolkit. So there are a couple of major image toolkits out there. The one that's actually included in core and basically just kind of available in most PHP situations is GD. It's actually good at this point for most use cases. Since PHP 8.1, it supports both WebP and AVIF. If you're running a little bit older PHP server, it's not going to support AVIF. That's something to be aware of. There's really no additional setup required, and you can configure this by just going to Media, Image Toolkit. You'll notice if you've installed Drupal, it's already set to GD, so you're just there. But there are other image toolkits out there. And this is the one, if you've done a lot of image manipulation, you've probably used Imagemagick, because Imagemagick just has a wider range of image formats that it supports. It does so many more things in terms of giving you options to change like color profiles, which doesn't sound all that important, but sometimes when you're transforming an image, it may not show up quite the same way on, like, say, an older Windows machine than it does on an Apple computer, because the underlying kind of image profiles that they're using there are just totally different. So you end up with like much darker shadows, or maybe a particular color that gets washed out, that type of thing. And Imagemagick allows you to play around with that a little bit and get your best. This was probably more important about 5 years ago than it is now. I think now most of the defaults work pretty sanely across modern systems. So unless you're supporting an older system, you probably don't need to worry about it. But it does have some advanced image effects that you can do with Imagemagick that's pretty cool. I've found that host support is pretty good for this if you're with one of the major Drupal providers. So, you know, the Acquia, the Mazes, the Pantheons, I almost said Platform SH, Upsun, they changed their name. You know, if you're not using one of those, then you actually need to check with your host for availability, and it may be a case where they have to install it. So something to
cover the issues binary.
Pardon?
You need I forget what the binary is, but you need.
Yeah, you actually have to install Imagemagick at the level of PHP, so you have to have that level of access to be able to use Imagemagick.
A module that says configure the binary, and I forget what it is, but you need there's a program.
If you're configuring it yourself and not having it provided by the host, so yeah. Okay, so image toolkits allow us to create image styles, and image styles have been around in Drupal for quite a while now. They were a contributed module in Drupal 7. They're part of Drupal core. They allow us to apply effects and transform images. So in practice, what that looks like is we can do things like a typical image style might be something like this. We can use focal point, which is a cropping toolkit or a cropping module. And we can crop an image to be 330 by 165. This would, I guess, be for like old iPhones or old Androids. It's been a while since they were actually 330 pixels in density. And then you could convert it to WebP. And the only thing you have to really keep in mind is you really want to do the order of effects in the right order. It's always best to do your cropping and scaling and all the things that are going to transform your image with the original style. And then when you do your conversion, you do it at the very end. So pretty straightforward. You can do some pretty advanced effects. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could add text to images. Maybe a good use case for that would be if you need to watermark your images so that you can say that there's a copyright on them or something like that. You can do things like give the image a transformation that converts it to a circle with a transparent background behind it. You could do this with CSS as well, but it is an option so that you actually have the image there so that it's taking up the space in a different way. I mentioned transparent backgrounds. You can do grayscale conversions, or really any sort of color mapping conversion. So if you wanted your images to all have some sort of like purple sheen or something like that, you could totally do that. And then you can do custom color fills. So like any of those transformations where you're adding shapes, you could then apply color fills to it. So say you had something where you wanted your editors to have something, you can do this with CSS again, but say you wanted your editors to have like a color block that you were then going to apply text over the top of whenever that image is used as a featured image. You could actually do that at the level of the image effect. It's pretty powerful. When you look at image styles, you get a typical list like this. I pulled up this example because I think this is really critical. It's something that Drupal CMS introduced with including responsive image styles in Drupal CMS. You'll notice the naming convention here. It gives you the ratio, the exact size of the final image, why you have that image. You know, is it portrait? Is it a focal point? And then it gives you the final format that it's outputting as. I love this convention because I can look at this and I know what image styles I have. If you're not using a really good naming convention, image styles get funky real fast, you know, small, large, narrow. What does that mean? You know, so I love this naming convention. I love that Core included it. I think it's a good best practice to use. Okay, so now we've talked about image styles. The next thing is responsive image styles. And you might be saying, okay, I've got image styles, what's responsive? So the idea for responsive image styles is it allows you to specify either through a very fixed art direction or through a set of commands to let the browser pick. It allows you to specify a different image for different device display widths. So if you're thinking about my big monitor at home that has 4K and I've got lots and lots of space, and you know, obviously that's a huge number of pixels across, I can actually deliver a larger image for that than I deliver for my laptop screen or my iPad or my mobile phone. So that's basically the idea behind a responsive image. They're defined based on breakpoints or view widths. Breakpoints are defined in your theme. You basically specify here are all the points we want to break at. And it could be like Bootstrap standards, I think, is like 1440 and 1200 and 768. And those are just the different widths that your device is. Now keep in mind, this is the width of the device regardless, and like when you change orientation, your device width changes. So if I'm looking at a mobile phone vertically and I change it horizontally, I'm actually dealing with a different breakpoint depending on how big that device is. Breakpoints are the best implementations of responsive images. This is not specific to breakpoints per se, but the best implementation of responsive images also take into account pixel density. Who here knows the pixel density of a modern iPhone?
3x?
Roughly 3x, yeah. So I think it's like a weird decimal number. I can't remember if it's a little bit higher or lower, but you know, when you go into your browser and you say, I want to look at responsive mode, it will actually let you change your 1x, 2x, 3x. So you can say, oh, I'm looking at something that is 375 pixels wide, which is a typical iPhone width or Android width. But I need to actually look at it at 3 times pixel density, because if I've set up my responsive images correctly, it's actually going to deliver a larger image to that device than 375 wide. Because 375 wide is going to look slightly blurry because it's not enough pixels in the overall image. So you want to take that into account. If you set it up the right way, you can actually let the browser choose the best image. And the way that you do that, actually, here's my example for pixel density that I think is kind of one that people have to wrap their head around. If I'm on an old computer with a 1024 pixel width, I'm actually going to get a smaller image than a modern mobile device with 375 times 3, right? Because that's a much bigger overall image. It's like 1200 something, no, 1300 something compared to 1024. So that's just something to think about, is when you're setting up your image styles, you're having to think about both that pixel density and device width. Device width is kind of this relative thing. It's not an absolute thing. So this is where I was going to get into the idea of the 2 different ways that you can set up responsive images. There's a way that you can do it that involves the picture element, and within the picture element, it defines the different images that load, and it's very specific. It's like, this picture element will load for this width at this breakpoint. And so it gets really, really, really specific. Drupal core, or I'm sorry, Drupal CMS, if you were to install it right now, you would see almost everything defined by picture, right? It's basically saying, I want very, very specific breakpoints for everything. I'm actually going to recommend that that's not the best way to do it, because what it says is if I'm at this device width with this breakpoint, I deliver this image, which may not let the browser pick the best image. So if you use source set instead, which is actually an attribute on the image element, it will actually allow you to define a set of images with some widths, and you can give it a set of sizes for when to choose those widths, and the result is that the browser will say, oh, okay, this is everything available to me. This is my current resolution. This is my current viewport. I'm going to pick the best image for the user. And my understanding is browsers also take into account bandwidth speed. So if they see that you're on a really slow bandwidth, they can actually choose to deliver you a blurrier image as a way to kind of compensate for bandwidth. So all things to kind of keep in mind as you're setting up picture versus source set. Now, one time that you have to use picture is when you're actually controlling your design for an aspect ratio. So an example here would be like, you have this hero image that you want to be 16:9 widescreen on the desktop, but then when somebody looks at it in mobile, they're actually getting either a square or vertical image. Because that image is a different, ratio, and those two different devices, you need to be able to tell it, hey, I'm expecting that this particular breakpoint at this particular density is this device, so deliver it this image. So you can get like really, really specific with this and get really creative in the image that you actually deliver to the final device. As an example of this right here is an example using source set, but it's from what it looks like in configuration. I'm just going to say right now, if you're not like really geeking out on this, you're probably going to find some same defaults from a recipe somewhere and install those, because this gets really kind of complex in terms of what you're setting up. But if you look at the breakpoint group here, I've actually chosen responsive image instead of a like specific breakpoint of like 1440 or something like that. And the reason why is because then I can say select multiple image styles for 1 times viewport sizing. So I'm giving it all over to the browser. And then I have a set of rules here, and that's a little bit blurry on this screen, but it says, like min width 512, then deliver the 512 pixel wide image. If the min width is 608, then deliver the 608 pixel. And then if it's 100 viewport width, pick the image that you want to use. And it has actually at the very bottom of this list of all the images that you check, you have a fallback, and it can actually load that fallback image as well. So get really, really specific in terms of what you're delivering, but again, unless you really geek out on this and get into it and understand what you're doing, it's easy to deliver the wrong image or think you're doing something, and always double check your work when you're setting up image styles like this, because they get complex. All right, so we've talked about image styles, we talked about responsive images, we talked a little bit in image styles about cropping. I do want to go over a couple of different cropping options that you have. Core has cropping, like you don't need to install anything to do cropping of images, but what it does is really give you 2 options. It gives you scale and crop, which if the subject is, well, I say it only works if the subject is centered. You get the option in your image style of saying I want it to crop from the top left corner, or I want to crop from the center. Typically people are going to leave it at the center. But the challenge there would be like, it's scaling down your image and then it's cropping based on whatever the center of the image is. And your user is going to upload an image that has a guy off to the side pointing his finger, and then it crops it and you only get his finger. Like that's the result. So that's a core cropping kind of, I've never really used it for a project because there are other options. Crop and scale also rarely works, because if you crop it first and then you scale it, well, it's choosing your crop based on not knowing how big the image is. So it literally could just like crop it and just give you a chin and nothing else, or in my case a beard, because so we need better solutions than what Core provides. We have a couple of options. Both of these contrib modules require a crop API module in their composer.json, so you don't actually have to composer require crop API. You're going to get it from either one of these, but just to understand that there is kind of like an underlying module providing some of the power here. Image widget crop allows you to crop to any dimension. So if you have a use case where you need your editors to be able to select, like drag, I'm cropping this, and this is exactly what I want to see, then image widget crop is actually pretty cool. The only catch with it is there's no good way to enforce ratio. So if you're trying to use it for design direction, where you're doing like featured banner images that you need to be 16:9 or 2:1 ratio, that's just not going to work because it doesn't enforce that ratio. I wish it did, because it actually is more intuitive for editors to be able to drag the little widget and like, oh, this is exactly what I'm cropping. The other option, and this one has become really popular in many Drupal implementations, is focal point. So focal point basically will crop based on a set of crosshairs that you point out the center point of the image. So let's say my example earlier, you got the guy and he's pointing, and he's to the left of the image, then you would move your crosshairs to the left of the image over that person, kind of centering it maybe like on their chest so that you're trying to capture their head and waist. And then it's going to crop from the top and bottom with the focal point in a landscape situation. That works really great for landscapes. It presents challenges with portraits. And the example actually I don't have that slide in there anymore. The example I like to give is similar to earlier where we were talking about the design direction, where you wanted to get the landscape for one and then the portrait for the other. Imagine a person perfectly centered on the frame, but what you've uploaded is instead of a 16:9, you've uploaded a 9:16. So it's a portrait image, right? It is taller than it is wide, and then you apply focal point to it. You end up with a crop that may cut off their forehead and their chin, depending on the image size, just because of the nature of the ratio. So focal point really has a hard time with that kind of portrait concept. Here's an example of a focal point image style. So you can see here that you first do the crop and then you do the conversion. This one is fairly straightforward. If it's a little bit difficult to read, that's 1800 by 1080. That's a 16:9 ratio. So it's actually going to take, and you can see my source image. If it looked like this, it will create a derivative image that matches that ratio, right? One important setting as you're editing the focal point scale and crop is you can choose to allow upscaling. I do not recommend it. What that means is it's going to blow out your image and add pixels that didn't exist, which gives you a really blurry image. I do recommend when you're using this type of technique that on the image field itself, you're setting some requirements for what the minimum image size is. So in this example, if I'm going to support 1800 by 1080, my image field actually needs to say they cannot upload an image that is less than 1800 for this particular use case. So really powerful, but oh, actually I did leave the focal point challenge. So you can kind of see it here, you know, the portrait photo, if you're thinking about the cropping on that, taking off, and all of a sudden you cut off the 3 to 4 if you left the focal point in the center, as an example. All right, so let's talk about this game changer that I found. I fairly recently discovered this in the last 6 months to 8 months, somewhere in there. Implemented it on an intranet for a county, and I'm like, where have you been all my life? This is amazing. So what it allows you to do is choose 2 different image styles based on the aspect ratio of the output, right? Or the inputs, the 2 different image styles. So if the image is landscape, I can give it a focal point cropping, which works really good with landscape. But if it's portrait, I can say, you know what? Just place this on the canvas centered and don't do any cropping to it. Because if they uploaded a portrait of someone, it's likely like a profile image or something like that. And I want it, even if it's being used in a feature image where it's 2 to 1, I don't want it to do any weird cropping things where all I get is somebody's face, right? So aspect switcher allows us to define that in our configuration. So landscape images, definitely do focal point. Square, because that's basically its default settings. It's if the ratio is greater than 1 to 1, which is square, then place it on a 16:9 canvas, and then maybe add a background color, or leave it transparent and add the background color via your CSS, because that gives you more creative control, right? And then let the theme control it. No more cutoff heads. One interesting thing, there is an option in setting the background. I found one that allowed, it's like another submodule that you can add to image effects to allow this, but it will actually like take the image and then blur it and throw it behind in the empty space, and it creates this really trippy effect that some people like, and I look at it and I'm like, it bothers me a lot. I much prefer the CSS technique.
That came from people doing video like this.
Oh yeah.
Right, and then they're showing it on the news.
Yeah, I mean, it's that same sort of effect, but you can do it with, I mean, if you really want that effect, if your client is like, hey, can you give me that effect? It doesn't exist out there. So this is what Aspect Switcher would look like. You end up with your landscape image style and your portrait image style, and then your ratio adjustment. So in this case, I've said if it's greater than 1. I could actually make it more specific. Maybe instead of 1:1, I actually want it to look for 1.2:1, or maybe I only want it to apply this if it's greater than like 3:4, because if I'm thinking about a 3:4 ratio, at that point I'm thinking like typical camera on its side. Maybe I can crop it with the focal point and get a decent image if they've set their subject far enough back, that sort of thing. But it gives you that kind of option to tweak that and get it to what you want. So far for me, I've just basically said if it's portrait, I want to see their portrait image. Let me see what it looks like. You then have your specifically. So that was if I'm editing the Aspect Switcher. When I'm done with the Aspect Switcher, you'll see it kind of like lists out all of the effect. It's telling you everything it did. And what you may not be able to see there just because of the size of this on the screen is I have a second command that I'm giving it, which is resize it to my overall size that I have up there. Now there's a reason for this, and this is because what I found in implementing Aspect Switcher is if I didn't apply a resize at the end, it had actually stripped that information from the image, and so it couldn't correctly render in a responsive image style. The responsive image style, whenever I added it to it, basically like crap out and said, I need an image in width, or I can't do a responsive image. And just by adding that extra resize command, it fixed that problem. So if you end up trying this out, that's a really important step, because when you add it to the responsive image style, it will fail if you don't. Benefits, you can get a specific design direction. Editors can upload in any orientation. They don't have to edit their photo first, and it's probably going to do something pretty close to what they expect, giving all that consistent aspect ratios. And I actually, seeing it in action, it's fairly professional looking, especially if you've got a good CSS background for those that have the transparent background on the image. So to get image Aspect Switcher, you need to install the Image Effects module, and I just wanted to call out that there are a few more things that you can do with it. You can add watermarks, borders, frames, color adjustments. I mentioned text overlays earlier. You can mask things out with all kinds of shapes. Like, there's just so much you can do with it. I used to, between Image Effects and Imagemagick, I used to like optimize. I had a set of commands that I would drop in that would optimize the image based on whether it was a JPEG or PNG, because they actually use a different set of commands, because they're two totally different image formats, but they were all trying to convert with one, and I needed to like kind of smart convert between those two. That's not really necessary anymore with WebP, because WebP can handle both rasterized images and flat logo type images without problem. So just a side note there. So live demo, y'all love live demos, right? How are we doing on time? Oh yeah, we got time for a live demo. I can just find my screen. There we go. All right, so first I want to call out my image styles page here, and I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger since we are working with a kind of a weird projector. I'm going to scroll down because this is, first of all, Drupal CMS at its best. All of these image styles that you see with this great naming convention up to 16:9 are explicitly created by the Drupal CMS recipe. That's a lot of freaking image styles, isn't it? Yeah. So you can see down here they begin to change a little bit, and so what I would call out is if you look at like 512 by 288, I have an aspect switcher image style. That aspect switcher image style is now calling this focal point and this portrait. So you're getting 3 image styles that are in working in combination with each other, right? And if I look again, if I go into my aspect switcher and hit edit, I'm going to see that the first option is what do I want for landscape, what do I want for portrait, and then it's pulling in those 2 other image styles. Now, this is really important because the naming convention, if I was creating a brand new one, and I left one uncreated so that we could do this live. Let's see, this is the 304 by 171. So Drupal CMS created my default focal point. I now need to create my aspect switcher, and I need to create my portrait image styles. Well, actually, I first need to create my portrait style because I'm going to use it in my aspect switcher. So let's do that real quick. I'm going to do add image style. So I actually copied my really well-named image style, and then the very first thing I'm going to do is change its name to portrait. You'll notice it gave it a new machine name. It's a whole new image style, but it's following that same convention as my other ones, so that I can see them together whenever I do autocomplete situations, which I'll show you that in just a moment. So I'm going to hit create new image style. The first thing I need to do is say I'm going to scale this. So another advantage to the naming style that I love is here I am going to the scale. I now need to know the width and the height. Where do I get that from? If I didn't name this 304 by 171, I'm going to have to remember 304 by 171. I don't know about the rest of you, but my memory is not that good. So by having it in the name of the image style, it makes it really easy for me to go in here and add 304 by 171. Again, I am not going to allow upscaling because that does awful things to images. And after I've scaled it, the next thing that I need to do is I need to keep in mind, this is my image style that I'm using when I just want to align it on the canvas, right? So the very next thing I need to do after scaling it, which is going to change it to basically a height of 171 if it's portrait, like the 304 is actually not going to do anything here because I expect this is greater than the ratio. So it's always going to give me my height as the scaling option. So now I'm going to go in, and I told you all those options you have. Look at all those. Set canvas, add. Again, I need to know those aspect ratio. 304 by 171. I want the canvas to be an exact size. I'm not doing relativity here because, again, these are all flowing into responsive image styles. In this case, I want my placement to be absolute center. But, I mean, you could choose to put it in one of those other quadrants if you wanted to. Maybe you have something where you want that portrait image to be to the left and fill to the right, or be to the right and fill to the left. This supports that, right? Maybe you put a gradient in there so it looks like it's just kind of fading into the portrait image or something like that. Totally allows for that. You can do offsets and whatnot. This one's kind of important, the canvas color. This is where I'm setting it to transparent. That way, the part that I'm setting it into, everything on the outside of it is going to be transparent. That lets me put CSS into the background for that image and style it, or more likely the container for the image that's sitting behind there. So I'm going to add that effect. And then, again, order of operations is important. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to convert this. Whoops. I'm going to convert it to WebP. And for the really quick among you who maybe saw, there was actually a convert avif in the list, and there's a convert avif in the convert. And that's just like ImageFX is adding a different avif conversion because it's such a new implementation in this space that there's just 2 out there. You could use either one if you're using the avif styles. So now I've got my style, everything I need there. I can hit save. And if I go back to my image styles, I now have 2 of my 3. So I've got my focal point and my portrait, and now that I have those 2 inputs for my aspect switcher, I can go to add image style. Again, I'm going to copy the naming convention just so that I can get a really consistent And now, the first effect I'm going to add is aspect switcher, add. And remember I told you about the naming convention being important? I'm now going to start typing. And because I was really consistent with it, I can actually do 304 and I see all the ones that would be applicable. Don't add your aspect switcher to your aspect switcher. That would be aspect backwards. Oh. So I'm going to do my focal point for landscape. My kids would be so proud of that dad joke. Here's my portrait. I'm not going to change the ratio. That's just what I'm going to use. Add that effect. And then again, because aspect switcher loses some of that size information, I'm going to go ahead and add a resize, which isn't really doing anything other than adding that metadata back to the resulting image. Okay, so now I have all my image styles for that aspect switcher. And again, I've only configured this for 16 by 9. Like every ratio that you want to apply this sort of art direction, you have to do associated. Me personally, I would not have like 16 by 9 and 2.1. I'm going to go through and clean this up at some point. I've actually, with WebP being such a small image, I tend to reduce my total image styles to about 3 to cover kind of some of the major devices. Mobile browsers are doing a great job with resampling these days, so if it's off and it's not like the perfect ratio for the mobile device, it still shows a really high crisp image. The only people that might, call it out would be somebody with like just really, really fine attention to detail as it comes to, like image styling and formatting and that sort of thing. And I've shown it to my daughter who's like digital graphics and she can't tell the difference, so I feel like I'm safe. Let's see, so I've got all my image style there. Now the next thing I need to look at, if I go to media, I can go to my responsive image styles. And again, thank you Drupal CMS, I have so many responsive image styles. The one that I'm using for my featured images on my blog is 16 by 9 large. I can edit this and we can see how I have, this is to give me a source set styled image. And then the image styles that I want to include in that image are all going to be the 16 by 9 aspect switcher, right? I don't need to use my other 2 image styles because aspect switcher is using those 2 image styles to give me the resultant output. And then at the very end of the day, I end up with that ability that when someone uploads a portrait image, and this could be something as simple as, I'm going create, image, choose file. Actually, I don't remember. The graphic looks like it would work. We'll try it. All right, so this one already has a transparent background, but if it didn't have a transparent background, it would just put the transparency to the side. This is just going to make the transparency wider. I'm just going to call this decorative. I'm going to save. And why don't I go ahead and place it in an image here? I've already got a featured image here. This one is landscape. So if I look at this landscape image, you'll see, by the way, for those of you who don't know, this is like the Drupal default image, right? It's like all of your image styles use this image from Drupal core, right? If you know the image well, it's like a 4:3 ratio image. This has cropped it to a 16 by 9. So it took off the top of the one balloon and it took off a little bit of the vineyard down below and it made it that aspect. So now if I go in here and edit this and I switch it for my newly uploaded slightly greater than square and hit save. Oh, I was wrong. That was not greater than square because it didn't crop it right. I had everything ready but this image. What do I have? Well, I am going to call that as a presentation fail. But let me assure you, if I had a square or greater than square image, it would correctly crop it into that space. That image, I bet you that's like a like a 0.98 to 1 ratio image that I just tried to do that with, instead of double checking the image ahead of time.
Or go change your ratio in your aspect switcher.
Oh, I could, couldn't I?
Got a reaction. Or not
You know, I could, but I would have to do it for every aspect switcher style in order for it to load the correct one. And I can't remember for the life of me at full screen which one is actually loading, so that I could actually show that in real time. It would be better if I had a vertical image to just drop in there. I still want to do this for y'all. So how much time we got?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Y'all get to see my photo library. Oh, that one's a great one. So let's see here. I want to image, share, because that's how I get it to export to a format that Drupal can handle. I hate that Apple did this, but they made it a little bit harder. To export these days. So I'm just going to do a photo of 100% quality exported. I'm going to drop it on my desktop. That is a vertical image, so let's give it a shot here. And for those of you that met Mishaya last year, yes, that is her as a 1-year-old. She's 24 now.
Get that up so
Yeah, I was going to say, that was pretty good. You're getting her to review your stuff.
Trust a child that small.
All right, save. Hey, there we go. It didn't quite do the transparency correct, but we see a vertical image. So, not bad for like recovering there. I will give myself some props for that. So that brings us to the end of the live demo. In summary, use modern formats, use WebP, use AVIF. Choose the right toolkit. You can probably get by with GD for most projects. Make sure your effects are ordered correctly. That does make a huge difference. I personally recommend using source set over using picture in most situations because it lets the browser choose. Implement focal point for editors because it's a cool way for them to express their intent when they're doing the upload, which I didn't actually drag the focal point in there. I should have done that. And then use aspect switcher for mixed orientations because it gives you this better editor experience. And that sums it up. Actually, I'm going to drop back to this one. Again, connect with me on LinkedIn or Drupal Slack. I'm Joshua on the end both. So, questions?
I had one that I think I missed. When you're doing the aspect switcher, you had mentioned adding the sides or resize or something as one of the options. I just want to make sure I do that step so it actually does the thing.
Yeah, so if I go back to my media, image styles, I can pick any one of my aspect switcher styles here, but you have to do it for every aspect switcher style. Again, you probably don't want to use this many styles. The Drupal CMS is a little overkill, but if I go into any one of the aspect switchers, what you'll see is there's this resize effect. It's a secondary effect. And all I'm doing in that resize effect is I'm giving the height and width attributes back to the image that aspect switchers chose. Because something about the aspect switcher image effect loses that height and width, and this adds it back in for responsive images to be able to use.
It's like exif metadata or something.
Yeah, exactly. It is exactly that. Whenever you look at the file width and height, that's basically what it's loading back in, which is probably going to appear on your image for like your default. Whenever you upload an image, you know how you can add the height and width fields and have it specified? It should auto load based on this stuff as well. So.
This is really cool. like singing this, I had no idea about it. But I did want to, the image widget crop, you can actually set aspect ratios on there, and you can set up multiple crops.
Oh.
So we've done that. There's a place where you have to add each one, and in your image style, you have to pick which crop to apply. But then you have a little vertical tab set in the image editor where you can, and you click on it, and then you can drag it bigger and smaller, but it maintains the aspect.
But it maintains that aspect ratio. I think, you know, I may not have gotten that far with it because I didn't like the fact that editors had to do multiple crops if there were multiple crops in the system. And I didn't want it to default to always crop. So that may have been why I didn't use it, or it could have been just like what I inherited for the project. But that's good to know, that you can do image widget crop with an aspect ratio. Because that is, I like the UI of having the rectangle a little bit better.
Yeah, we've been using Focal Point more recently just because it is the easy click, but I always like the image widget crop solution there.
You know what's interesting? Since trying this out, what we experienced with this county that I implemented it for is that the editors rarely change the focal point. Yeah. And so it was one of those things where, like, the focal point of being the center on a landscape image, if it's a 4:3 ratio image and you crop it in the center, if they're anywhere close to a decent photographer, that's usually going to be okay. And because we're not cropping the portrait at all, it really just reduces the time the editor even has to think about it. But then your power users have that ability to move it around, and certainly with landscape images, it's easier to specify a focal point than it is with portraits. So. But good to know that image widget crop can do the aspect ratio.
I really like the aspect switcher, but what kind of blew my mind, just because I wasn't aware of it, was like converting the image format. Was like I'm wondering if there's anything else that we have to consider when we're using like WebP versus like PNG, and it's just like I'm like, why on our website and like the various websites that I've worked in the past, we've never used the like convert the image format to something, you know, much smaller and like.
I still think it's pretty rarely used. It's like the top shops that are doing image optimization that have figured out. That may have killed it. That's okay. I really do think it's the top shops that have done image manipulation that have like figured out, oh, I want to make a performant site. I need to reduce all these, and I deliver responsive images for every site. The number of JavaScript-based headless implementations that I've seen out there that are like, oh, I'm just going to do image fluid with the biggest image I have as the background image, and I don't care how big it is legion. I mean, like that's the default. I think that mindset of a front-end developer does not always go to the how do I deliver the least possible, because they're like, I have a high-speed bandwidth connection. Why don't they? But it's really, especially if you're working in government, nonprofit, education, like these are the areas where we need to think about equity, and we need to think about delivering the smallest thing. And I love that WebP kind of makes it so we don't have to think about JPEG versus PNG anymore, right?
Yeah.
We just
Exactly.
use WebP.
Yeah.
It's supported by enough browsers now, unless you got something really legacy that you're trying to support.
Yeah,
It's
like
there.
The pixel density thing, I mean, that, my recollection is that's like a PNG, because a JPEG is just, what do you want a good best, or, it compresses the image, but the pixel density.
Yeah, so compression is
only
different
in
than the density,
Yeah.
and it really like
Yeah.
you could have a JPEG that was compressed to like 50% that's going to look blurry no matter what.
Yeah, right.
Or you could have a JPEG that's compressed at like say 80%, but because of pixel density, you actually need to deliver a much larger image for it to size to the right thing. Yeah, it's kind of critical. But again, WebP takes some of that out of there. By the way, WebP does have compression similar to JPEG. So if it sees it's a rasterized image as a part of the conversion, there is some over compressing that can occur there. There are settings in image effects if you're using Imagemagick where you can actually be very specific of, I only want to compress it this much. So if you're seeing that your image quality is not quite what you want, and I think the defaults are pretty good, but if you're seeing you want them to be just a little bit better, there are options for getting that geeky about it.
I like everything from this.
Good, thank you.
The summit. I'm like, this is like the #1 thing that right away, easy, like I have to do and apply. like as a to-do, so it's awesome to like
Oh,
come
nice.
away with like, oh, hey, guess what? We get to do, you know.
Go optimize your images,
Yeah,
folks.
exactly.
Are there tools like Optiping and JPEG Optim for WebP? Or do you need them?
I don't think you need them. I think GD and Imagemagick do enough in their compression. Again, you can Imagemagick, you can definitely specify the compression and kind of change it from whatever the default is. I don't know what the default is off the top of my head for what it chooses to compress to. But the defaults look good, and it makes the images so much smaller, it's worth doing. I mean, I'm seriously, if you've got JPEGs all over your site, just switching to WebP, you're talking about 70 to 80% reduction in file size, which is a reduction in your bandwidth, it's a reduction in the load time for your users, it's huge. So.
Are there modules or code that will allow you to full scale, take all my JPEGs and turn them into WebPs and update the file management table?
Actually, this is there's not modules. There's Drupal. Literally, I have done this with a site that had all the image optimization for Imagemagick that did like JPEG versus PNG, and we were like, you know what? We want to optimize all the images to WebP. All we did is go through and edit our existing image styles to pull out our Imagemagick rules, drop in the WebP conversion, and hit save. When we deployed that to production, you warm your cache, and your images are all updated because Drupal generates your image style upon viewing. And so that first view after you've changed it actually converts it and saves it in the directory the way you want. So don't need any extra modules for it, it will do it for you. Definitely test it locally first. But yeah, it does it for you. All right, well thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you again.